This is Dream Cove. The village of Millbrook smelled of wet hay and turned soil, and in it lived a boy nobody claimed. Elias had arrived at 8 years old, carried in on the back of a hay cart after a fever took both his parents in the next county over. The widow Hale took him in out of duty rather than warmth, gave him a cot in the barn, and told the village he was hers to feed, not hers to love. The children of Millbrook learned quickly what their parents thought of the barn boy. He wore trousers patched at both knees, boots 2 sizes too big, stuffed with newspaper, and a shirt that had belonged to 3 other children before him. When he walked past the schoolyard fence, the other boys called him Hey Boy, and the girls simply looked away, as though poverty were something that might rub off if they looked too long. Elias never answered the taunts. He had learned, somewhere in the space between losing his parents and learning to sleep in a barn, that arguing with unkindness only fed it. So instead, he did something stranger. He got up before the sun most mornings and quietly fixed things. He noticed old Mr. Doyle's fence had a broken post that let his goats wander into the widow Hale's cabbage patch. So, before anyone woke, Elias found a fallen branch, sharpened it with his pocket knife, and hammered it into place. Mr. Doyle never knew who fixed it. He simply noticed one morning that his goats had stopped wandering. When the school teacher's well rope frayed and snapped, dropping the bucket into the dark water below, it was Elias who spent an entire evening after chores, tying a new rope from scraps of twine he'd collected over months, so quietly that Miss Ferris found it repaired the next morning and simply assumed her husband had done it, though she had no husband. He never asked for thanks. He never even signed his work. He simply moved through Millbrook like a small, patient ghost, mending what was broken and asking nothing in return, because the one thing poverty had taught him was that being noticed rarely brought kindness. It brought pity, or worse, suspicion. One winter, the youngest Doyle child, a girl of 6, wandered off, chasing a stray dog, and did not return by dusk. The village searched the obvious places: the creek, the schoolhouse, the mill, while panic rose with the falling temperature. Elias thought instead of where a frightened child might hide, and remembered a hollow beneath the old oak, where he himself had once hidden after a cruel taunt. He found her there, curled against the dog for warmth, too afraid to call out, and carried her the whole mile, home on his back, without a word to anyone about how he'd known. When the Doyles thanked whichever searcher had found her, no one thought to ask the barn boy, and he never volunteered the answer. There was an old farmer named Thaddeus Crane who lived at the edge of the village, a man so bitter about a son who had left for the city years ago that he had stopped speaking to almost everyone. His fields had grown wild with neglect. His barn roof sagged, and the village children were forbidden from going near his property, warned that he might chase them off with a shotgun of harsh words, if nothing else. Elias went anyway. He started small, pulling weeds from the edge of Crane's cornfield before dawn, leaving before the old man ever woke. Then he mended a hole in the barn roof using scavenged shingles. Then, without a single word exchanged between them, he began showing up every single morning to help with whatever needed doing, disappearing again before the old man could ask his name. For 3 months, Thaddeus Crane assumed some kind of miracle was occurring on his farm. Then one dawn, he woke earlier than usual and caught the thin, patched-up boy from the barn kneeling in his cornfield, hands raw from pulling weeds. "Why?" the old man demanded, voice rough with disuse. "Are you doing this?" Elias, startled, nearly ran, but something in the old man's voice wasn't anger. It was closer to confusion, the kind that comes from being surprised by kindness after expecting none. "You looked tired," Elias said simply, "and your fields looked sad." Thaddeus Crane said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back into his house, and Elias assumed he had ruined everything, that tomorrow there would be a shotgun waiting, or at least a sharp word. Instead, the next morning, there were 2 cups of coffee sitting on the fence post, and an old, weathered hand waving him over. They worked the fields together after that, mostly in silence, the way 2 people do when neither has had much practice trusting anyone. Thaddeus never asked about the barn, or the widow Hale, or the boots stuffed with newspaper. He simply taught Elias how to read the soil, how to know when rain was coming by the smell of the wind, how to graft a broken branch back onto a tree so it could keep growing. Word spread slowly, the way it does in small villages, not through announcement, but through accumulation. Someone mentioned that their fence had been quietly fixed. Someone else recalled the well rope. The schoolteacher finally admitted she had no husband, which meant someone else had repaired it, and suspicion turned gently toward the barn boy nobody had ever properly thanked. Then came the storm. It arrived in late autumn, without warning, the kind of storm that tore roofs from barns and flooded the low fields where half the village's winter grain was still waiting to be harvested. The river that ran along Millbrook's edge rose faster than anyone had seen in a decade. And by midnight, word came that the Hendricks family, an elderly couple who lived closest to the water, hadn't been seen since the flooding began. Every able-bodied man in the village gathered lanterns and rope, but the water was already waist-deep on the low road, and no one wanted to be the one to wade into a current strong enough to have already claimed a neighbor's fence and half a chicken coop. It was Elias who went in first. He had spent enough nights in a drafty barn to know that fear didn't keep anyone warm, and enough years being invisible to know how it felt to be forgotten in the dark, waiting for someone to come. He was not going to let the Hendricks feel that. He tied a rope around his waist with hands that had learned to knot things properly from Thaddeus Crane, and he waded into water that reached his chest, calling out names into the wind and rain until a faint voice answered from the porch roof where the elderly couple had climbed to escape the rising water. It took 4 trips through a current that nearly took him twice, but by the time the sun rose gray over Millbrook, both Hendricks were wrapped in blankets in the schoolhouse, and the barn boy, who had arrived with nothing, sat beside them, shivering, saying nothing, expecting nothing. The village gathered the next morning, not to gossip this time, but to talk about him, about the fence, about the well rope, about Thaddeus Crane's fields, which everyone now realized had somehow been quietly restored to life over an entire season. About a boy who had spent 2 years fixing what was broken in a village that had never once fixed anything for him. The widow Hale, who had never called him anything but the boy in 2 years, walked to the barn that evening for the first time since he'd arrived, and found him mending a torn blanket by candlelight. "Elias," she said, using his name for the first time anyone could remember. "Come inside. There's a room upstairs that's been empty too long." He looked up, uncertain whether he'd heard her correctly. "It has a real bed," she added, quieter now, something unfamiliar softening in her voice. "You've slept in a barn long enough." Thaddeus Crane came the following spring, leaning on a cane that hadn't been there before, and asked the widow Hale a question that changed everything: whether the boy might like to inherit a farm someday, since his own son had never once come back to claim it, and Elias had done more for that land in a season than blood ever had in a lifetime. Elias cried for the first time anyone in Millbrook had ever seen, not from sorrow, but from the strange, overwhelming weight of finally being wanted rather than merely tolerated. Today, the fields at Millbrook are green and well tended. The fences never break for long, and the well rope has never frayed again. Children who once called him "Hey Boy" now bring their own sons and daughters to learn how to graft a fruit tree from the quiet man who never asked for thanks, because he had learned that the truest way to be loved was never to demand it, but to become impossible to live without.